It's the early 1700s. Somewhere in the warm waters of the Caribbean, a merchant ship is making good time toward port. It's a rich little ship. Down in the hold, there's gold, there's spice, there are bolts of silk that have traveled half the world to get this far. Up on deck, the crew isn't thinking about any of that. They're thinking about the pay they're owed, the rum waiting in the next town, and how solid ground is going to feel again under their feet. It's an ordinary afternoon until the lookout at the top of the mast goes quiet. There's a sail on the horizon. At first, it's nothing. Ships cross paths out here all the time, but this one isn't passing by. It's turning toward them. It's following. And it's moving faster than a ship that size should be able to move, which usually means someone has stripped it down, packed it with men, and built it to chase. Then they see the flag. Most of us already carry a picture of what comes next. The wooden leg, the parrot, the treasure map with a red X, the growling man with the eye patch. It's worth setting that picture aside for a while because the real story is stranger than the one the movies told. For a short stretch of history, out on the open sea, some of the poorest and roughest people alive built something unexpected. They made their own small world out there with their own rules, their own way of splitting whatever they took down to the last coin, their own way of choosing who gave the orders, and their own way of removing him if he turned out to be no good. We'll get to all of that. For now, the merchant crew has a problem. The captain is shouting. The men are scrambling, and most of them already know from tavern talk and stories passed between ships roughly who is coming up behind them. In a few minutes, they'll have to decide whether to fight or hand it all over. But the people on the other ship are the ones worth talking about. Almost none of them were born to this. They came from somewhere, and most of them ended up under that flag for reasons that had very little to do with adventure. So before we find out what happens to the merchant ship, it's worth going back to see where those men came from in the first place. Start with a young man on the docks of an English port town. Call him no one in particular, because that's roughly what he was. 17, maybe 18. No money, no trade, no family worth going home to. He's looking for work, and work in those days often found you before you found it. One evening, a group of men surround him. They don't ask questions, they don't make an offer, they simply take him, the way the Navy took a lot of men back then. And by morning, he's at sea on a warship, whether he agreed to it or not. His old life is over before he's fully understood it's gone. The first weeks are their own kind of education. The ship is crowded far past what's comfortable. Too many bodies, not enough air, and a smell below deck that never quite leaves your clothes. The food is what nobody else wanted. Biscuit gone hard and full of weevils, salt meat aged past the point of being recognizable, water that has turned a color water shouldn't be. Men get sick, not from battle, which almost never comes, but from the conditions themselves: bad food, foul water, close quarters, and a ship's surgeon who, more often than not, makes things worse. A man in the next bunk takes ill and is simply gone within the week, and nobody acts surprised because this is ordinary. Above all of it sits the discipline. On a ship like this, the captain's word is final and absolute, and the punishment for crossing him is the lash for stealing food, the lash for talking back, the lash for falling asleep on watch, even if you'd been awake for the better part of 2 days. Our young man watches a sailor flogged until he stops moving and learns the lesson that was meant to be learned. There is no arguing here, and there is nowhere to go. As for pay, there's a grim joke in it. When the wages come, if they come, much of the money is already owed back to the ship for the basics a man needs to survive. A pair of socks might cost a week's earnings. A man can serve for months and walk away with almost nothing to show for it. So men try to leave. They desert when they can, and some throw themselves into worse odds rather than stay. When deserters are caught, they're hanged where everyone can see, which is the point of it. The punishment isn't really for the man who ran, it's for everyone still watching. This is the life, and it's against this life that the rumors start to mean something. Because at night, in the dark, sailors talk, and some of the talk is about other ships. Ships where the captain doesn't rule by the lash. Ships where the crew has a say in what happens. Ships where the money gets split openly and a man is actually paid what he was promised. At first, it sounds like the kind of thing desperate men invent to comfort themselves, but the stories keep coming back, with too much detail to be pure invention. Then, one day, it stops being a rumor. The ship is overtaken by a smaller, faster vessel, the kind built to chase, and there's no real fight to speak of. What happens next is not what our young man expected. There's no massacre. Instead, there's an offer. Anyone who wants to join is welcome to. The choice is yours. You'll have a voice in how things are run, and you'll be paid your share, openly like everyone else. A good number of the crew step across. He's one of them. The new ship is no paradise. It's still cramped, still dangerous, still a hard way to live. But the difference is real, and he feels it immediately. He's paid his share. He can watch the loot divided in front of him. The men in charge were chosen and can be unchosen. For the first time since the night they took him off the docks, he has some say in his own life. The first surprise for a man stepping onto one of these ships is that there are rules at all. He'd expected chaos. What he finds instead is a set of articles, agreed on and often written down, that every man aboard has sworn to follow. These weren't grand documents. They were practical, made by people who'd learned the hard way what tears a crew apart. But read them now, and something stands out. For their time, they were strikingly fair. The first article on many ships was the simplest and the strangest. Every man has a vote in the affairs of the moment. Not the officers, not the wealthy. Every man. Where to sail, whether to attack, what to do with a captured ship. These were matters the whole crew could weigh in on. In a century where most people on land had no say in anything that governed their lives, this was close to unheard of. Then there was the matter of the loot, which was the whole point of being there. The articles laid out exactly how it would be split. The captain might take a slightly larger share, and a few skilled men like the carpenter or the surgeon a bit more, but the gap between the top and the bottom was small. A common sailor on one of these ships could earn many times what he'd ever have seen in honest work. And because the rules were known and agreed on in advance, there was little room for a captain to quietly cheat the men below him. Some articles went further than anyone would expect. There were provisions for men hurt in the fighting. Lose an arm or a leg in service of the crew, and the articles promised a set payment out of the common fund before anything else was divided. It was, in its rough way, an early form of insurance written into the rules of an outlaw ship at a time when no government and no honest employer offered anything of the kind. Other rules were about keeping the peace among a crew of armed and short-tempered men. Quarrels couldn't be settled with violence aboard ship. If two men had a dispute they couldn't drop, they took it ashore and settled it formally with witnesses so that no one was knifed in the dark over a grudge. Gambling for money was often banned outright, not out of any great morality, but because crews had been wrecked by debts and accusations over a game of cards. Lights and candles had to be out at a certain hour. Everyone was expected to keep his weapons clean and ready. There's another detail worth pausing on. On a handful of these ships, there were women among the crew, fighting and working alongside the men. It was rare, and it ran against everything the world ashore believed about what a woman could be. But the logic of the ship was simple. If you could do the work, you could have the place and the share that came with it. None of this came from high ideals. The men who made these rules weren't philosophers, and they'd have laughed at being called reformers. They built their articles for plain reasons. A crew that has a say in things, that trusts the split is honest, and that knows a bad leader can be replaced, is a crew that holds together and fights hard. And there was a practical pull, too. The Navy could force men into service, but a pirate ship had to attract them. It had to offer something better than the life these men had run from. So it did. The result, almost by accident, was a way of living that gave ordinary men more voice and a fairer deal than they'd find almost anywhere on land. It existed on the wrong side of the law, on small wooden ships in dangerous waters, and it never lasted long for any one crew. But for the men who'd come from the lash and the rotten biscuit and the wages that vanished, it was something they'd never had before, and they knew it. That was the draw. It also made these ships something the powers on land could not allow to continue. By the early decades of the 1700s, this way of life had stopped being a scattered nuisance and become something the great powers genuinely feared. And the fear ran deeper than the stolen cargo, though there was plenty of that. A robbery is a simple problem. You lose some goods, you take the loss, you carry on. But these ships were a different kind of trouble. They showed sailors everywhere that the life they'd been told to accept wasn't the only one on offer. Word traveled from port to port, ship to ship, that out there on the water men were splitting their takings fairly and choosing their own leaders. To the men who owned the ships and ran the trade, that idea was more dangerous than any single raid. It helped that the pirates understood something about fear itself. The most feared captains of the age built their reputations less on slaughter than on the threat of it. A ship coming up fast under a dark flag, crewed with wild-looking men making all the noise they could, was often enough to make a merchant crew give up without a fight. And that, oddly, was the point. A captain who surrendered lived to sail into the next port and tell everyone how terrifying it had been. The story spread, and the next crew was half-beaten before the chase even began. It was a way of ruling the sea without having the largest navy on it. For a while, the whole thing flourished. There were towns, real ones, where these crews could put in to repair their ships, sell what they'd taken, and spend their share. These weren't hidden coves, they were working harbors with taverns and markets and merchants happy enough to deal in goods with no questions attached as long as the silver was good. For a brief stretch, a man under the dark flag could live almost openly in the right port. That was exactly what the authorities could not tolerate. So they answered with everything they had. Governors were ordered to stamp it out. Warships were sent specifically to hunt these crews down. Courts set up to try captured pirates, and in those courts, the outcome was rarely in doubt. A man brought in was usually a man already condemned, and the sentence was carried out quickly and in public, on the waterfront where every passing sailor would see it. Slowly, the balance tipped. The navies grew faster and better organized. The safe harbors were pressured, cleaned out, or turned. The open water that had once been wide enough to disappear into started to feel small. The men who'd been at this the longest could sense it. The good years were closing. Around this turning point comes one of the stranger episodes of the whole era. A crew is taken, and as the prisoners are sorted out, it emerges that two of the fighters among them are women. They had been armed. They had fought alongside the men, by every account as hard as anyone aboard. And when this came out, it caused a stir far out of proportion to anything they'd actually done. It wasn't that they'd been especially cruel, it was what they represented. A woman with a cutlass in her hand was a woman who had stepped clean outside the place the world had assigned her. She wasn't supposed to be able to fight, to sail, to choose this life at all. Her very presence said otherwise, and that unsettled people more than the robbery ever had. What became of those two women afterward is uncertain, and the records grow thin and then simply stop. But the story outlived them by centuries, passed along not because of what they stole, but because of what they were. Proof that the life under the dark flag had room, however briefly, for people the world ashore had no room for. By the end of this stretch, the tide was clearly turned against the pirates. The harbors were no longer safe. The patrols were everywhere. The wide-open era was nearly finished. But it didn't go out quietly, and the way it ended became the part everyone remembered. The end of this era was not gentle, and it was not quick. It came as a long, grinding campaign by the powers on land to wipe the dark flag off the sea for good. It opened with spectacle, A famous captain is run down at last, killed not on a gallows, but in a hard fight aboard ship, and afterward his head is carried back as a trophy for everyone to see. The intent was plain. This is what becomes of men who defy us. Look closely and take the lesson to heart. But the lesson didn't always land the way it was meant to. A sailor watching a pirate captain's head paraded through a harbor didn't necessarily think, "I'll go be a good and obedient man now." Some of them thought the opposite, that if this was how it ended either way, they'd rather end it under their own flag, on their own terms, than rot for wages on a ship that treated them like cargo. For a while, the harder the authorities pressed, the more stubborn the holdouts became. These final years threw up one last great captain, by most accounts the most successful of them all. In a stretch of only a few years, he took an enormous number of ships, far more than anyone before him. What's striking is that the records don't paint him as a monster. He was, by the standards of the trade, fairly disciplined and not needlessly cruel to those he captured. What made him formidable was sheer skill and nerve. He seemed to understand that the game was ending, and he meant to wring everything out of it that he could before it did. He's also remembered for the code his crew lived by, one of the most complete sets of articles from the whole era. It wasn't a few lines scratched on a scrap of paper. It was detailed and orderly. How the watches were kept, how the loot was divided, what a man was owed if he was maimed in a fight, what the punishment was for breaking faith with the crew. Read together, it amounts to something close to a small constitution for a small community of outlaws, written by men the law had cast out. His end, when it came, became one of the lasting images of the age. A warship caught his vessel at last. The fight was short, partly because his crew was in no condition for it, worn down and the worse for drink after their own celebrations. In the middle of it, he was struck down on his own deck and killed. What his crew did next is the part that stuck. Before the warship could take his body and make a trophy of it the way the authorities liked to, his own men gave him to the sea instead. They weighted him down, wrapped as he was, and let him go over the side into the water he'd spent his life on. By the time the warship took the vessel, the captain they'd come for was gone, beyond anyone's reach. No gallows, no head on display. The one thing the powers on land most wanted, they never got. That single act did as much for the legend as anything he did alive. He had spent his years refusing to be ruled, and in the end, his crew made sure that even his death wasn't handed over to the people who'd hunted him. After that, the campaign became methodical. Crews were run down, captured, and tried in numbers. Many were hanged. The waterfront executions came one after another until the message was impossible to miss. There's a darker thread running through it too. Among the men these crews had freed and taken aboard were people who had been enslaved, and when the authorities cleaned out the captured ships, a good number of them were simply sold back into slavery. Whatever rough equality had existed under the dark flag, the world that crushed it had no intention of honoring. Within a generation, it was effectively over. The safe harbors were broken up. The patrols made the old open water life close to suicidal. The wide window that had let this whole strange experiment exist had swung shut. And yet, the campaign that destroyed the pirates also preserved them in a way the authorities never intended. To convict a man, you needed records, so the trials produced testimony and copies of the very articles these crews had sworn by, and detailed accounts of how they'd actually lived and organized themselves. The men who set out to erase the pirates ended up leaving behind the most complete record of what they had been. Without those documents, gathered to hang them, we'd know far less about how fair and how orderly some of these outlaw ships truly were. So the era ended in rope and gunfire and broken harbors. But the paper survived, and so did the stories, which by now were already starting to outgrow the men they were about. The pirates lost. That part is worth saying plainly. The harbors were taken, the leaders killed, the crews scattered or hanged, and the open ocean that had hidden them was closed off by patrols and better ships. The powers on land set out to end it, and they ended it. But something outlasted the ending, and it's stranger than the swords and the gold. Within a few generations, the world ashore began moving, slowly and painfully, toward ideas that those outlaw crews had already been living. The notion that ordinary people might have a say in the rules that governed them, that a leader who failed could be removed rather than simply endured, that what a person earned should bear some honest relation to the work they did. None of the people pushing for these things on land would have pointed to a pirate ship as their model. By then, the records were buried, and no respectable movement would have claimed such ancestors anyway. It's almost certainly not a straight line. It would be too neat to say the pirates taught the world anything directly, and the honest answer is that we can't trace it that cleanly. What can be said is that for a brief stretch, on small wooden ships in dangerous water, people put these ideas into practice and made them work well enough to be remembering. The alternative wasn't just a theory anyone could dismiss. It had actually happened out there, and plenty of men had seen it with their own eyes. The way we remember them now gets almost everything wrong, of course. We've turned them into costumes: the parrot, the eye patch, the buried chest, the cartoon villain, or the dashing rogue. It's harmless enough, and it's fun, but it's a long way from the truth. The real people were rougher and sadder and more interesting than any of that. Most of them came to it not out of a taste for adventure, but because the lives they'd been handed were close to unlivable. Some of them were violent, some were just desperate, and a few of them, almost without meaning to, built something fairer than the world that had thrown them away. It's tempting to make them heroes, and that would be a mistake too. They robbed people. They frightened people. Some of them did real harm. The point isn't that they were good men. The point is that the world they ran from was, in its own quiet and lawful way, often crueler than they were. The lash, the rotten food, the wages that never came, the men forced into service against their will, the trade in human beings that the respectable powers carried on without a second thought. Set against all that, a crew that voted and split its takings fairly doesn't look quite so lawless after all. So here's what the sea kept. Not the treasure, which was spent or lost long ago. Not the ships, which rotted or burned. What lasted was a small, stubborn proof that things could be arranged differently, that ordinary people, given the chance, will reach for a fairer deal and a voice in their own lives. The pirates didn't set out to prove it, but for a while, out on the water, they did, and that turned out to be the hardest thing of all to hang.